the first part needed to happen. We needed to become aware. We needed to start defending ourselves from, the Chinese Communist Party predations through globalization and the internet. But second stage 2, I'm really hopeful for, in this next administration, whoever is elected, that we really double down on the American people. STEM education, science and technology investment, infrastructure, manufacturing, all of those things are going to lead to tremendous economic growth. Build a secure, encrypted, nationwide internet for the American people that protects their data.
In the eyes of retired Air Force General Robert Spalding, what is the most powerful tactic the Chinese Communist regime uses to exert its influence on Taiwan, the US, and beyond? What was it like to see democracy in action during the recent Taiwan elections? Will they impact Beijing's calculations around invading Taiwan? What is the significance of the China Phase 1 trade deal? And what kind of enforcement measures does it have? And why is it critical that the US not become complacent about the communist China threat? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. In this episode, we'll sit down with Robert Spalding, who previously served as Chief China Strategist for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon and also on the National Security Council. Currently, he is a Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Rob Spalding, it's great to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
It's great to be back. Thank you.
So, Rob, you went to Taiwan recently to observe the election. What did you see there? I mean, it's an incredible result, but what did you see?
Well, it was actually quite exciting. We went to a KMT, the last KMT campaign rally, and the last DPP campaign rally, and both of them were boisterous and exciting, and people were generally excited, it seemed to be, about the election. And then, of course, I got to go to a polling station and watch people vote. And then afterward, even more impressive was the way they do the counting. And okay. It's very peculiar to Taiwan. One person lifts up the ballot and calls out what it says, another person writes it out on the board. And then, even more interesting, anybody from Taiwan, a citizen from Taiwan, can come in and dispute any ballot. And so, in addition to myself and other folks that were in our team there was people seated watching the vote count, and people would wander in and wander out. And it wasn't just elderly people from the neighborhood. It was also very young people. And I got to talk to a few of them, and so so for me, I've spent my entire career in the military, and I used to feel so privileged because I could vote via absentee ballot, and I would get my ballot in the mail, and I would check it and send it in. And so the first time I ever went to a polling place was in Taiwan, and
okay, wow,
and it was actually quite inspiring, and so I kind of realized what I'd been missing, because I think it's that whole process of going to the polling station. It's really part of this idea that we have a representative government, and to see the people of Taiwan so fully involved in the process and really excited to, whether it's a KMT or DPP candidate they're going for, or one of the other minor parties, just to have the opportunity to register their vote and have a say in their democracy. That whole process for me was incredibly inspiring, and I'm kind of glad now that I'm retired and I'm going to be able to go to a polling place here for the first time, this year when we cast our votes for the election. So, and it also, really, for me, made it more real, the lie that I heard when I was in China, which is Chinese people can't have democracy. It's not, it would be too chaotic for China, and yet here in Taiwan, where we have a lot of Chinese that escaped the Chinese Communist Party in 1949, essentially have one of the most if not the most vibrant democracy in Asia, putting the lie to that. It's just, so it was, for me, it was an incredible experience, and I'm thankful to have had that opportunity.
It's really interesting because I think I saw you say that you have a kind of renewed confidence in, but you didn't say what, but maybe in democracy, what I'm hearing, and then maybe in, the hope for China. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. In this process that I've gone through the last 5 or 6 years, trying to understand, this competition, economic, financial, informational, political competition with China, where, time after time I've heard from corporate America, from Wall Street, from others that, our system is not working, it's failing, it's not a great system. Actually, the Chinese have a better system, and very wealthy people in this country believe that we ought to adopt that system. And having lived there and understand the Chinese Communist Party, it can knock your confidence down. But when you can go to a young democracy like Taiwan, it kind of really gets you pumped up for what we have, and inspired and excited about that. And excited and inspired to defend that, and I think that's what I was referring to. I'm completely revived and reinvigorated in this campaign, which I think is going to be a long campaign, as we reestablish our identity as a democratic nation that's fully committed to prosperity, to freedom. And really promoting that, not just at home, but also abroad.
I want to get back to this idea. Every time I hear someone tell me that there are people of influence in this country and around the world that believe that the Chinese communist system is superior somehow, I don't even know what to say or think. So it always catches me off guard. But anyway, going back to Taiwan, 3/4 of the country basically participated in this election. And it also feels like a kind of, to me, like a spectacular failure of Chinese Communist Party influence operations. And I know this is something that you're very interested in. I'm wondering if I'm reading this right, other people have said this, and what's your take?
Well, I think that we have to understand that for them it's the long game. And yes, there may be setbacks, but our challenge is not to get too confident during those setbacks and then take our eye off the ball. Because in that confidence, in that hubris that we tend to have, to believe that there are no challenges to democracy or capitalism as a way of organizing our economic activity, then that's when they're going to seep in and begin to change people's minds, and they do it relentlessly. It's not like there's this tendency to believe here in the West that you can make them give up, or make them, essentially deter them, right, by just showing, once that you're onto them. And it has to be consistent, and it has to be consistent in the way that we challenge the Soviet Union's effort to really dominate Eurasia and really the world. The Chinese Communist Party is no different in terms of what it seeks to do, maybe in terms of how it portrays itself, or in terms of what are the characteristics that are peculiar to the Chinese Communist Party. But at the end of the day, they want to see the suppression of the freedoms and the principles that we find dear. And if we are not constantly vigilant, constantly fighting, constantly struggling to preserve what we got, and not just prevent them from undermining it, but also strengthen our own societies, then we're gonna see a constant erosion that we've seen since the end of the Cold War. And I think we can't get too confident. We have to be vigilant, and we have to continue to move forward, because they're not gonna give up.
The Chinese Communist Party has, in these influence operations to many countries around the world. They've been increasingly more documented. It's arguable that Taiwan, and many people have argued that it's the strongest in Taiwan. And I'm wondering if you could offer how that actually happens.
Well, I mean, it's really about money, right? It's about the market pool of 1.4 billion Chinese and financial incentives. And the Chinese Communist Party uses that game over and over and over again. And so, when Taiwan under Ma Ying-jeou started reaching out to increase these economic ties with the Chinese Communist Party, there's billions of dollars invested in mainland China. Those investments create financial ties that then incentivize the people that invest that money to continue to, want to nurture those because they don't want to lose their investment. Well, because the Chinese Communist Party has created this almost bear trap of a financial system, the money goes in but it can't go out. Once you're in, and you can't get out. And so now, it's almost like, people are very hesitant to walk away from an investment that that they see potentially slipping away, and so they'll double down, and that's what tends to happen. And so I think what happened in Taiwan is that, yes, there are those relationships, but then you have the majority of people in Taiwan that don't have the means to have billions of dollars invested in the mainland, and quite frankly, they want to preserve their freedoms. It's the same thing here. The majority of people want to be free, and then you've got a few people that are heavily invested in China, and they're essentially captured by those investments. And so it's a very simple process. It's about greed.
And so would you say that these investment dollars as a form of influence are more significant than all these other things, like, for example, the investment in media that the Chinese Communist Party made in Taiwan and
so I think those are effective.
Yeah.
But they're only effective to the extent that you're not aware that that's what's going on.
Okay.
And so, democracies tend to get distracted easily, and there's no focusing element that comes from a totalitarian, for instance, in China, the Chinese Communist Party controls the media. So if they want the population focused on something, they're going to be focused on it. In the United States, it can be, it can literally be like the proverbial dog. Dog sees a squirrel, and that's the thing that they're focused on. And so our media environment can be quite distracting and can essentially draw people's gaze away from what the Chinese Communist Party was doing. I think for this election in particular, and especially with what's going on in Hong Kong, the people of Taiwan were very aware of what the Chinese Communist Party was doing. And so that awareness just, once that begins to happen, those things become far less relevant. It's when we're distracted, it's when we're focused on other things that it becomes, a little bit more effective, because quite frankly, it comes in through your day-to-day life. It's the goods you purchase. It's the media you consume. It is not, coming at you directly in your face. It's kind of coming at you from the sides. And if you're focused on something else, then it's going to tend to be more successful. Use WeChat, use Baidu, use Alibaba. Okay, those are great, but what do they bring with them? Well, they bring with them, in this day and age, the ability to monitor what you're doing, and then to begin to turn that back around and subtly influence your daily habit patterns.
You mentioned Hong Kong. That was somehow changed how the Taiwanese people thought. How significant was that in your view?
I think it's really strong because I think there's a kinship because the Chinese Communist Party has this idea of one country, two systems, and Hong Kong's the example of that, and the success of Hong Kong feeds into this idea that Taiwan could also be successful. And then of course you realize that the people of Hong Kong completely repudiate one country, two systems now, and yet Xi Jinping doubled down and said, we're going to do one country, two systems for Taiwan. I think it's just, I think it just tied together for them. The people of Hong Kong value their freedom. They don't want one country, two systems anymore because they realize the Chinese Communist Party is untrustworthy. And then the Chinese Communist Party comes right, behind that and says, well, we want to do one country, two systems. And so I think it was very, it was between the Chinese Communist Party and the people of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was very relevant for this election.
You mentioned you went to the DPP and KMT rallies. These are the two dominant parties and the two dominant presidential candidates. I'm going to read a tweet that you wrote and just get you to elaborate a little bit. So you said, the Taiwan election is a vote against the CCP, but not necessarily a vote for President Ing-wen, so Tsai Ing-wen, because the DPP got less votes this time than in 2016. So this is a little bit of insider stuff, but it's...
Yeah, well, I think it was what I meant to portray there was not necessarily for the DPP. It clearly was for Tsai Ing-wen because she got more votes than any president's ever got in the history of Taiwan. And so the point is the DPP, when you go just on the straight party line vote, the DPP maybe got 500,000 more votes than the KMT. So it wasn't a slant. President Tsai got almost 3 million votes more than Han Kuo-yu. So I think it's clearly a vote for Tsai, not necessarily a vote for the DPP. And clearly, because of Tsai's policy about leaning more towards the U.S. and less towards the Chinese Communist Party, it was clearly a vote against the CCP.
Well, so it's interesting because, like here in America, typically the politics are portrayed as left and right. Whereas in Taiwan, it's not nearly that clear cut, right, between the DPP and the KMT.
Well, technically, you could stand in Taipei and look south, and then it would be left and right. So, left would be U.S., right would be China.
It's been argued, right, that for example, some of the people that are KMT supporters, and there's of course quite many of them, that voting for KMT isn't voting for being specifically pro-China. It's just a different kind of patriotic.
Well, so here's the KMT, the challenge. Amongst the older generation in the KMT, it was very much a pro-China camp. But then the younger folks of the KMT don't actually agree with that. And so I think the KMT as a party is quite conflicted, and they have been for some time. And so, and again, it stems from these not just financial ties, but also cultural ties, because a lot of people came from mainland China. Particularly the older generation have an affinity for mainland, and I think that came out in their politics. Unfortunately, the younger people realize, particularly watching what's going on in Hong Kong, what comes with that. I mean, there's a price to pay for that allegiance to China and the Chinese Communist Party, and the young people don't want that. So I think the KMT is going to have to do some soul searching, because there's not a big army of supporters if they continue to go down this route where they're hewing towards the mainland.
I mean, the argument, right, is that we need to protect Taiwan, right, because there is this looming giant that can, with huge power, and who knows how much we can rely on the rest of the world. We have to protect ourselves. How do we do that? Those are the arguments I've heard. Do you think Taiwan can count on the U.S.?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the Pacific, as the Indo-Pacific, as Taiwan goes, the Indo-Pacific goes. And I think, it is a strategic territory in terms of the entire region and defending the region. And I think it's not only that, it's an important symbolic part of the region because, if we're not there for Taiwan, does that mean we're also not there for Japan and South Korea and our other allies and partners in the region? There's a lot to say, when you say, well, the United States would just abandon Taiwan. Because then you're saying, well, we're essentially going to abandon Asia. And, as I think we have a West Coast and an East Coast of the United States. And we're clearly a Pacific nation and a Pacific power, and derive much of our economic activity from the Pacific. And so we're not gonna just abandon that. And I think there's this tendency for people to want to use that as an argument to hew closer to the mainland. And I think it doesn't pass the logic test. Certainly for the United States, it doesn't pass the strategic interest test, and so it's a convenient argument for people to use to, I think, lend weight to allowing Taiwan to fall under the sway of the Chinese Communist Party.
In terms of people have been arguing that the Taiwan-U.S. relationship is strengthening. I think there's compelling arguments for that. What do you think of the current U.S. policy vis-a-vis Taiwan, and what would you recommend?
Well, I do think that we tended to downplay our relationship with Taiwan in order to strengthen our ties with the Chinese Communist Party. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party repudiates everything that we're about. And here's this little nation, just off the, 80 miles off the coast, that actually, embraces everything that we're about. And so they've been playing second fiddle to a totalitarian regime. And so I think this administration woke up and said, wait a second, why are we so close to a totalitarian regime when you got a thriving democracy right off the coast that's begging to have a stronger relationship? And so, it's about strengthening the ties, economic, financial, informational, and military ties with the people of Taiwan and the rest of the democracies in the region. And that is a way that we're going to, preserve and protect not just, our democracy, but other democracies around the world. We can't just shrink into ourselves and become an island unto ourselves, because what will happen is, as we've seen before, authoritarianism, totalitarianism will continue to creep closer to our shores. And so, as was the essentially the strategy after the end of World War II, we have to continue to be engaged in democracies and promoting them, not just militarily, but economically, politically, socially, informationally, all of these different elements of the United States that make us who we are as a people and as a nation. These need to be part of our going out and our engagement abroad, and they ought to be a hell of a lot stronger with democracies than they ever should be with a totalitarian regime.
It's been argued that we're kind of entering a potentially dangerous time period for Taiwan because, the economic difficulties that China has put itself into are beginning to show. Perhaps Xi Jinping is being, kind of put a bit against the wall. He needs to be strong. A past guest, Ian Easton, has told us about how the obsession that the Chinese military and frankly the whole Communist Party has with Taiwan and annexing it ultimately, of course it would be disastrous if there was an invasion or something like that, but they're planning on it. It's in numerous military playbooks from what I understand. So how does that look in your eyes?
Military activity in the Pacific would be disastrous for the Chinese Communist Party. At a minimum, if they want to preserve their rule, I think they've got enough, infrastructure in the country and enough, economic activity that they can sustain themselves for a while as the rest of the free world begins to realize that they're a predatory economy, and essentially prevent them from having access to those things. And they have enough of a connection to emerging market economies that they can continue to squeeze more out of that. As soon as they start, conducting military actions in the Indo-Pacific, all that comes to a screeching halt. And they become severely isolated, not just economically, but financially in all manner. They need energy, they need dollars to buy food and raw materials, and as soon as they start a conflict, that's all going to come to a screeching halt. What they're able to do now by essentially not having a military conflict, by portraying themselves as very peaceful, then they can continue to co-opt many in the free world who are willing to for profit support their efforts. And so I don't put a lot of credence. So that's number one. Number two, nuclear weapons make that the prospect of conflict where the United States and the Chinese could potentially be involved, far too risky for either the United States or China. Now, the great thing that Mao had that Xi Jinping does not have is that he had a very poor country with no infrastructure, no industry, really nothing. And so the prospect of a war with the United States could be more palatable in that when you're essentially a developing country that has nothing to lose. Well, they're a developed country. They have everything to lose. They have massive cities. They have infrastructure. They have manufacturing. They have technology. They have all of these things that they've spent trillions of dollars, a lot of it of our own money, to build. And the Chinese Communist Party, I don't believe, has any intention to risk that in a military conflict with the United States where you don't have necessarily an understanding where that escalation ends.
Years ago, I'm just recalling one of these Chinese generals, once in a while a Chinese general comes out and says something very boisterous, and this was like kind of beyond the pale boisterous. I forget whether it was west of Xi'an, but basically he said, we're ready to sacrifice a sizable portion of the population in nuclear conflict. I don't know if you remember this, but it was beyond the beyond. So you don't think there's anything to this?
Well, I mean, Mao is rumored to have said something similar, but again, the Chinese Communist Party has essentially witnessed the development on the backs of, quite frankly, the free world. That's unprecedented in history. Now, it doesn't really seem logical that they would put all of that at risk by creating a military conflict in the Indo-Pacific.
So let's talk about that development and how some of that development has been slowing a lot by even the arguably very fudged indicators coming out of communist China. We have a Phase 1 trade deal just kind of freshly signed. Can you give us an overview of what this deal is about? What does it mean?
It's probably the best deal that either side could have hoped to have, and yet not be a deal. And so I think the what they initially attempted to do was to forge an agreement that would allow for this relationship to continue forward in a more balanced way. And of course, the Chinese Communist Party had no interest in that. And so at the same time, you see these increasing tariffs and other elements that the federal government is beginning to put in place that actually begin to defend our economy and our people and our society from the Chinese Communist Party's predatory activity. And that's creating challenges for the Chinese Communist Party because it's leading to loss of employment. And then you've got swine flu, you've got fall armyworm, you've got rising food prices, you have slowing manufacturing activity, you have the moving and supply chains, you have the lessening of the current account to where the dollars that you need to buy energy, food, and raw materials is not there. And so I think Xi Jinping sees all of these mounting economic and financial challenges coming, and President Trump sees an election in 2020 coming, and quite frankly is being bombarded by Wall Street and corporate America saying that if you don't get a deal, you're going to lose the election. And so I think it's not the deal that either side wanted. And it's not the deal that China wanted because they've still got tariffs on $350 billion worth of goods. And they've just said that they're going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on buying U.S. products. Now, the good news about that is they actually do need food, and so and that's going to help them stay in power by importing pork and by importing soybeans. On the U.S. side, we didn't get the problem with the agreement is the fact that the Chinese Communist Party almost never actually honors the agreement. And so the good news there is you have enforcement mechanisms that, and then the opportunity to raise tariffs if they don't actually come through. So, and the president can turn to corporate America and Wall Street and say, look guys, I got the best deal I could. Now, Goldman Sachs immediately came out after the agreement and said, well, they still got tariffs on $350 billion worth of goods. This is not the deal that we were expecting. I think that it fulfills both sides' needs politically, economically, and financially. It will not result in a more balanced relationship between the U.S. and China because it's not the agreement that Lighthizer and Liu He originally negotiated that would have done that. Now, the problem and the reason the Chinese Communist Party could not accept that deal is it begins to unwind their tentacles of control over the entire economy and financial system, and that's just not something that they're willing to do. You know, as you know, China has two constitutions, their PRC constitution and the Chinese Communist Party constitution, and the one that governs China and the one that governs the Chinese Communist Party is the Chinese Communist Party constitution. And that one really is about the preservation of the party, and the way that the party maintains preservation is by maintaining control over the economy, and they're not going to give that up.
Yeah, there's a preponderance of evidence that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't live up to its obligations, international obligations. Let's talk about the enforceability here. I think the president has talked a lot about that in recent days. What is it in the deal that actually makes us feel secure that this will be enforceable?
Well, I think the two things. One is there's already tariffs remaining, and the ability to bring back more if they don't abide by it. I mean, the challenge for the Chinese Communist Party is to undermine the free trade system by using predatory behavior both externally and then anti-competitive behavior within the country. Tariffs are one element of a strategy needed to correct that. There's others. I think those others, while they haven't been as much in the media, are also contributing to this moving of supply chains, CFIUS reform. I think you're going to see an increase of the use of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, particularly because the Europeans allow some level of behavior that the United States doesn't. But China really is out there, directly paying people off to make deals for their companies, and so if you use that, if you do that, and the method of transaction is the U.S. dollar, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act comes into play. There's a whole host of other measures that the federal government is taking to strengthen this protection of globalization, where Chinese Communist Party takes advantage of it. All of those are coming into play. So it's not just the tariffs that are creating challenges for Xi Jinping and their economy. It's all the other things in addition to the tariffs. And I think it's just going to continue to grow. You know, the idea that our retirement system, that active military personnel's retirement system, are going to be invested in Chinese defense contractors that build the weapons that they may have to face someday, is, you know, just beyond the pale. And I think people are waking up to the fact that Chinese companies don't have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. More that trumps their responsibility to the Chinese Communist Party. That's Chinese law. It's written, and so that's certainly Chinese corporate practice. And so when you look at organizations like the Securities and Exchange Commission and our markets and our investment banks, you know, pushing these equities and bonds onto U.S. investors, knowing very well that the most important constituency for those companies is not the investor, but rather the Chinese Communist Party, is incredibly damaging. And I think, you know, what's going to happen is people that have been pushing this, there's going to be a dark stain on their career and record, and certainly probably a lot of litigation that will come along with all the hundreds of billions, or, you know, trillions of dollars really, of money that they have convinced, you know, retirement fund investors, you know, so institutional investors, university endowments, to put into China, to, in spite of the fact that they don't actually have a fiduciary responsibility to them. And, oh, by the way, some of these companies are supporting things like concentration camps and forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience, which just adds an element of horror on top of, you know, disgust for not paying attention to investor prerogatives.
Earlier, when we were talking about Taiwan, you mentioned, you know, money goes in, but it can't come out. And that, it sounds very ominous, and I understand it to be true, but can you explain how that works? I don't think that's very clear.
Yeah, you know, so, you know, one of the things that, if you remember a while back, the IMF included the renminbi as part of its current basket of currencies and special drawing rights. But it's a non-convertible currency. You can't just go, you can't go, and there's no market to trade your RMB for dollars. That exchange rate is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And so there's no, you know, there's no open market for exchange of that currency, number one. Number two, there's strict capital controls in China. So every transaction where RMB is flowing outside of China, the Chinese Communist Party has a handle on and controls strictly, which led to this, you know, this term, the Smurfs. The Smurfs were, you know, essentially Chinese people that were taking $50,000 worth of renminbi in a suitcase outside of the country, because that was the only way. So they were smurfing it out, and but this is unprecedented in the financial world. In other words, there's no other financial system that is as closed as China's, and so that's why you can't have a run on Chinese banks, because essentially the Chinese have built a closed financial system that insulates themselves from market-based activity with regard to financial transactions. Now, that is like, it's like building so, you know, say you have two teams, and one team has 50 players on a football field, and the other team has 10 players. I mean, it's like the advantage that gives China in terms of being able to call the shots with regard to financial transactions is really enormous. And therefore, it makes it very difficult for anybody, to really have a relationship with that in a financial sense, that can be considered anything other than one-sided on the side of China.
So they have this massive leverage. I'm thinking of the word leverage because you mentioned with respect to the trade deal, that when you think of the trade deal, you just think leverage. And if we have the leverage, this can work.
You must always have leverage in any kind of negotiation with the Chinese Communist Party. If you ever reach a point where you don't have leverage, they're gonna take you to the cleaners.
The leverage in the trade deal is the tariffs and some of these other mechanisms, the CFIUS and so forth that you described
and
earlier.
Further tariffs.
Right.
If they don't actually abide by the terms, then more tariffs. Essentially, we forego tariffs on December 15th, and then we reduce certain 15% tariffs down to 7.5% as a condition of them signing the agreement. They don't abide by the agreement; those tariffs come back. Now, the entire play on the part of the Chinese Communist Party was to get as many of those tariffs taken off for as long as they can. They're never going to sign a deal. They know that. So the best that they can do is to negotiate a deal where they can make sure that the December 15 tariffs don't happen and they can get the other tariffs down. That's the best that they could hope to do, and they achieved that. And so I think for them, it was the best win that they could achieve. It's not clearly what they wanted, but.
And I think there's like a 90-day window. If there's a complaint, then I think it's 75 days, and then another 15 days, and then the agreement can be canceled. Who is actually doing not the enforcement, but the assessment, whether,
That's a good question. I would imagine that's in the hands of the U.S. Trade Representative to essentially monitor and then recommend to the president a reestablishment of tariffs.
We'll do a deep dive into how that's actually working from the government perspective soon. So, what's the risk to America and potentially the free world with this deal, or is there any?
I actually wrote something for the Department of Defense that kind of talks about what's the worst case scenario for the United States. And really the worst case scenario is, I go back to our prior conversation, don't take your eye off the ball, right? Because as soon as you take your eye off the ball, you lose your focus. They're gonna swim back in and begin to put these connections in place, these financial, these economic, these informational connections that allow them to tighten the noose. And I think that's the biggest danger, is that we ever lose sight of what the Chinese Communist Party is. There's this belief that there's reformers and hawks, and if we could just get on the reformers, that they're actually closet Democrats that want democracy and freedom, and then the hawks are the ones that are causing all the problems. Right now we're in the hawkish phase. If we could just get over to the reformers, everything would be fine. No, they're both part of the same party, and they both have the same end state in mind. They just have different tactics for getting there. It's do you want
good
hide
cop,
and
bad cop, or something?
Yeah, it's like good cop, bad cop. Do you want hide and bide, or do you want in your face? Xi Jinping's in your face. Deng Xiaoping was hide and bide until he needed to be in your face with the Tiananmen massacre. So, this is one of the beautiful lies that the American China watchers have essentially collaborated with the Chinese Communist Party to perpetuate, that somehow we can make a deal with the reformers and everything will be okay. No, it'll just allow for them to have a little bit more time to insinuate themselves into our institutions to further strengthen that relationship so they can begin to suppress again. And I think, so to me, I'm not worried about war in the Taiwan Strait. I'm not worried about war in the South China Sea. I'm worried about us forgetting what the Chinese Communist Party is and going back to the way things were, where we're not aware, and we let 10, 20, 30 years go by, and suddenly you wake up one morning and you're every single morning around the breakfast table, you're reminding your children what they can say and what they can't say to prevent angering the Chinese Communist Party and bringing financial ruin on the family, right? Essentially filtering everything you do as a citizen to make sure that you're not coming under the thumb, the economic and financial, and really this connectivity thumb of the Chinese Communist Party, which, as I said in my book, with regard to Roy Jones, it is already there. We saw in the NBA, it is already there, and if we take our eye off the ball now, it will strengthen, and particularly as we become more connected with the wireless revolution that is 5G, and the data that it produces, you're going to see lessening of relevance of U.S. tech companies, strengthening of relevance of Chinese tech companies. So Facebook, Amazon, Google will be replaced by Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. And those will be the ones that are incentivizing us in our day-to-day activity. And as they strengthen their economic ties on the U.S. economy and other democracies, then they're going to be able to slowly incentivize our freedoms away.
Terrible vision there, right? It's something I think very few freedom-loving people would like to see happen.
By the way, I would hate to be a strategist right now in China, because I can see this clearly in what they need to do, but then you'd go to Xi Jinping and say, well, you need to do all these things to kind of open up, suck them in, and then you can convert them later. And he'd be like, no, we need to be tighter, we need to be stronger, we need to be more forceful. Like, no, that's not it.
Interesting. Yeah, hopefully. I'm pretty sure they're not going to get you on their payroll, though. How can these companies and frankly large investors that have invested these billions, if not trillions, into the Chinese system get their money back?
They can't. The money's gone. It's been spent.
So what happens next?
They're going to have to take a write-down. I mean, that's just the truth. The Chinese economy is, the debt level based on debt versus assets is it's 3 times. It's 300%. It's a $40 trillion plus debt level for about $2 trillion in assets. Excuse me, 12 trillion in assets. So, I mean, the money's not there.
Is this the reason that Wall Street is so invested in maintaining the status quo?
Yes. But you know what they say, if you find yourself at the bottom of a hole, and you're trying to get out, the first step that you take is to stop digging. To use a financial anecdote, or idiom is, stop throwing good money after bad.
What do you expect will happen with this trade deal now? You don't expect a final trade deal will happen. I think you've said that. How do you think this is going to play out?
How do I hope it's going to play out, or how do I think it's going to play out?
Why don't you say, how do you hope, and then you can also give us the other scenario. Yeah.
I think we're on a path right now of financial and economic decoupling. I think it's happening. I think there's so many people that don't want to acknowledge it's happening, but it is happening. Supply chains are moving. What hasn't happened is supply chains haven't begun to really fully move back to the United States, in spite of the fact that we've got the lowest energy costs in the OECD. We've got the lowest corporate tax rates. We have opportunity zones all over the country. Clearly, there's a desire and a need to bring back, for instance, manufacturing to the United States. We're severely underinvested in infrastructure, $5 trillion, and the civil engineers rated a D in this country. So there's a lot that needs to be done in the United States in terms of investment. We spend a lot on weapons, and so I'm hopeful that we're going to begin to turn inward a little bit and begin to invest in our own country. So those retirement funds and those university endowments are going to invest in our own communities and provide jobs for people. And then, our economy is going to begin to grow in a way that it hasn't for a long, long time. And I think, the first part needed to happen. We needed to become aware. We needed to start defending ourselves from, the Chinese Communist Party predations through globalization and the internet. But second stage, stage two, I'm really hopeful for, in this next administration, whoever is elected, that we really double down on the American people. STEM education, science and technology investment, infrastructure, manufacturing, all of those things are going to lead to tremendous economic growth. Build a secure, encrypted, nationwide internet for the American people that protects their data. Lithuania is the only country right now that's actually protecting, all of its citizens in the internet. It's still not where it needs to be, and I'd like to see, democracies really begin to understand the power of data to influence populations at the individual level and take measures to defend them through a secure, encrypted, nationwide network.
So, of course, you're talking about, this 5G network of the future. This is, a major topic for you, something you've done an incredible amount of thinking about. But wait, I would like to talk a little bit more about that. But before that, you said that's what you hope will happen. You've mentioned you're this decoupling advocate for a whole host of reasons. What do you think the likely scenario is? Is it that?
Yes, I think it is, but I try to imagine FDR or Marshall or Eisenhower, particularly sitting there in front of the big board, which is still available in the UK to go and take a look at, that's showing the invasion prior to D-Day. And he sits down and he writes his resignation letter. So, we're in a competition. We're in a competition for freedom in the world. And it's not the same kind of bombs and bullets competition. It's about ones and zeros and dollars and cents. But it's a competition nevertheless. And so just like Eisenhower was sitting there in front of that big board writing his resignation letter because he was really, he believed that he was going to be successful, but he was also recognized that there's a risk of failure. I think that's where I'm at. I see that, I believe we're going to be successful. I'm fervently, I have faith in the American people and in our system, in our government, in our Constitution. I have profound faith in that. But the Chinese Communist Party is every bit the adversary that we, quite frankly, have never been prepared for. And if we take our eye off the ball, we might not make it. And so, I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, a little bit. I mean, the bottom line from what I heard you say is basically any final deal that the CCP would sign would be a death knell for the U.S. They're not going to sign any deal. Right,
exactly. They're not going to sign a deal that actually leads to the demise of the Chinese Communist Party, which is essentially counter to everything that we believe as a people and as a nation.
Basically, you're saying that fair rules would lead to the demise of the Chinese Communist Party.
Right. A totalitarian system is never self-sustainable without the ability to reach out into other free societies for innovation, capital, technology, and talent. And I think they're trying to craft one by using as much as they can and get it to almost like a sustained system. But it's unsustainable in that in stifling the freedom and the creativity of a population, you stifle your own ability to grow your way out of challenges. And that's what they have. Now, they've been able to reach outside themselves to us to help grow themselves out of challenges. As we're aware that that's happening and that our own people are suffering, then their capability to do that diminishes, and therein lies their challenge of their system. So it is a closed system, and a closed system never works because people really, in their fiber want to be free, and they'll give it up for a good job and a roof over their head and the ability to send their kids to school and all the things that the Chinese Communist Party is promising. But as soon as those things start to slip, they're going to look around and say, why am I doing this? Why am I supporting this? What is in it for me?
Let's talk a little bit about, before we finish up, about 5G. And I saw you wrote, I guess, an open letter to the UK people in the Telegraph recently. You're very worried, clearly, in that letter. And maybe, can we use that as a way just to kind of explain where things are with respect to Chinese Communist Party, 5G development, Huawei, and then, what is Britain getting itself into?
Well, it's funny because the EU came up with this global data protection regulation because they were concerned about Facebook and Google essentially using their citizens' data counter to their interests. Right? They were concerned about privacy, and what they have failed to grasp is that the tools and the technologies and the techniques and the business models that the Silicon Valley tech companies created has been completely adopted by the Chinese tech companies. Except they just don't have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders like Google or Amazon or Facebook. They have a responsibility to the Chinese Communist Party. And I say in this letter, look, they're collecting this data. It's not stopping at the commercial level. It's going to intelligence collection and it's going to influence. That's the way their model works. And yet you're going to adopt them as your commercial partners. Well, how do you think that's going to result in the preservation of your own democracy? Now, they use things like the Snowden leaks for NSA and all. You can call the United States whatever you want, but at the end of the day, we're not looking to subvert the freedoms of the people of UK. And I guarantee you that the Chinese Communist Party is. And so if they're willing to allow their politicians to lead them into this trap, in spite of the fact that clearly they know, because of GDPR, the power of these things to influence their own citizens, and now you're giving that power to a totalitarian regime, it defies logic. But it's not the first time that politics has defied logic.
Wow, that's a powerful place to end. Rob Spalding, such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.